So one vision of America was put forward by Alexander Hamilton, who'd served in the war as Washington's top aide and would go on to be his first Secretary of the Treasury and probably would have been president himself had he not been born in the British West Indies. Hamilton had a strong personality and, as you can see, the beautiful wavy hair of a Caribbean god, and he had very definite ideas about what he wanted the future of America to look like. First, Hamilton wanted the country to be mercantile, which means that he believed that we should be deeply involved in world trade. Second, he wanted the U.S. to be a manufacturing powerhouse. We wouldn't just buy and sell stuff, we would make it too. He even invested in a plan to make Paterson, New Jersey a manufacturing hub, which of course ultimately failed because New Jersey. But to make a manufacturing giant, he needed a strong government that could build infrastructure and protect patents, but you already knew that he was in favor of a strong government because of course he wrote so many of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton also envisioned an America that was governed primarily by the elite. His party, which came to be known as the Federalist Party, would be the one of the rich, the able, and the well-born. I mean, just think, if the Federalist Party had survived, we might have had a bunch of, Bushes and Kennedys as president. Hamilton also wanted America to be firmly affiliated with Great Britain, which isn't surprising given his passion for elitism and trade. But there was an opposing view of what America should look like, and it's most associated with Thomas Jefferson. Let's go to the thought bubble. Jefferson wanted an America that was predominantly agrarian, with most people being small-scale, subsistence-level farmers. Maybe they would produce a little surplus for local markets, but certainly not for international consumers. There would be no international trade. And he didn't want manufacturing either. This small-scale local economy could best be served by a small-scale local government. It's not a surprise to find that Jefferson's sympathies lay with the anti-federalists, even though he benefited from the new Constitution a little bit since, he eventually got to be president and everything. Unlike the elitist Hamilton, Jefferson was an avowed Democrat, which meant that he distrusted concentrated power and privilege and believed that the masses could basically govern themselves. To him, government and concentrated economic power were greater threats to liberty than a tyrannical majority. Jefferson was a big fan of the French, and not only because he spent a fair amount of time in Paris as our ambassador there, he also liked the French because they fought with us in the War of Independence against the British, and because after 1789, he liked the way the French treated their aristocrats, that is, brutally. In general, Jefferson and his partisans, who called themselves Republicans, although some current textbooks call them Democratic Republicans just to make things incredibly confusing, preferred France just as the Hamiltonians preferred Britain. And this was a bit of a problem because France and England were pretty much constantly at war between 1740 and 1815. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So linked to these imagined Americas were the questions of how democratic we should be and how much free speech we should have. Jefferson and the Republicans wanted more democracy and more free speech. Well, sort of. I mean, during Washington's presidency, Democratic-Republican societies sprang up, the first opposition political parties, and in 1794, the Democratic-Republican Society of Pennsylvania published an address which made the point that, quote, freedom of thought and a free communication of opinions by speech or through the medium of the press are the safeguards of our liberties. The Federalists, on the other hand, saw too much free speech and democracy as a threat. And from this, it sounds like the Republicans were better Democrats, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, for one thing, many Republicans, including Thomas Jefferson, were slaveholders, and slavery is kind of the opposite of democracy. And for another, many were supporters of the French Revolution, and supporting the French Revolution after 1793 is pretty problematic. Because, as you'll remember from Crash Course World History, Robespierre was guillotining everyone up until the point where he himself was guillotined. Okay, so in the first real American presidential election, there weren't any political parties. There wasn't even a campaign. The election was uncontested, and George Washington won. He didn't even have to run for office. He stood for it. Washington's presidency is important for a number of precedents that he set, including the notion that a president should only serve 2 terms, and the idea that even if he was a general, the president should wear civilian clothing, but he wasn't the real policy brains. Hamilton was. Washington probably wouldn't have called himself a Federalist, but he backed Hamilton's plan for a stronger nation. And to that end, Hamilton began the great American tradition of having a 5-point plan. Point 1, establish the nation's credit worthiness. Hamilton realized that if the new nation wanted to be taken seriously, it had to pay off its debts, most of which had come during the war. And to do this, Hamilton proposed that the U.S. government assume the debts that the states had amassed. Point 2, create a national debt. That's something you don't hear politicians say these days. Hamilton wanted to create new interest-bearing bonds, hoping to give the rich people a stake in our nation's success. Point 3, create a Bank of the United States. This bank would be private, and it would turn a profit for its shareholders, but it would hold public funds and issue notes that would circulate as currency, and the bank would definitely be needed to house all the money that was expected to be raised from point 4 a whiskey tax. Then, as now, Americans like to drink, and one sure way to raise money was to set an excise tax on whiskey, which might reduce drinking on the margins or cause people to switch to beer, but what it would definitely do is hurt small farmers who found the most profitable use of their grain was to distill it into sweet, sweet whiskey. So the whiskey tax really upset small farmers, as we will see in a moment. Point 5, encourage domestic industrial manufacturing by imposing a tariff. For those of you who think the U.S. was founded on free trade principles, think again. Now, you'll remember that the Republicans wanted an agrarian republic with freer trade, so they disliked pretty much all of Hamilton's plan. They also argued that none of this was in the Constitution, and they were right. This position of expecting government to be limited by the text of the Constitution came to be known as strict construction. But the Republicans lacked a 5-point plan of their own, so their only hope of success was to shave Hamilton's 5-point plan down to 4 points, which is what they did. In 1790, Republicans, many of whom were Southerners like Jefferson, struck a bargain. They agreed to points 1 through 4 of Hamilton's plan in exchange for a permanent capital on the Potomac in the South, as opposed to the first 2 temporary capitals of the U.S. in New York and Philadelphia. So the Hamiltonian economy won out for a while. Probably the most immediately controversial aspect of Hamilton's plan was the whiskey tax, and not just because people loved to drink, but also because farmers loved to turn their rye into whiskey into profits. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers even took up arms to protest the tax, and that clearly could not stand. Washington actually led, at least for part of the way, a force of 13,000 men to put down this whiskey rebellion, becoming the only sitting president to lead troops in the field, and America continued to tax booze as it does to this day.